Okay, so we're now live.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Peter Wayne. I'm the president of the Louisville Bar Association, and I welcome you today to our Louisville Unplugged series. As many of you all have experienced changes in your personal life, given the impact of COVID-19, we had a lot of aspirations this year for doing these events in a much more engaging format, at least physically engaging format, where we would be in a unique setting throughout the community. But like all things COVID-19, we've adjusted, and we're excited that this is our first version of this. Okay, Lisa is telling me we may want to hold for a second. So Scott, so I'm gonna delay my introduction, and I will repeat myself in a minute when Lisa gives me the green light. So
You must be waiting for a few more people to join.
Sure thing.
Okay.
It's a good test run, though.
We're all friends here, so.
You're exactly right. I think everybody's been on enough Zoom calls to know they stop and start. Okay, so Lisa's telling me to fire away. So again, for those of you that are just joining us, I was doing a brief introduction, and then I will kind of go at it again. My name is Peter Wayne. I'm the president of the Louisville Bar Association. This is the first of our Zoom-oriented or Ring Central-oriented Louisville Unplugged series. Like many things COVID-19, our aspirations at the beginning of the year were to host these throughout the community at various locations, really to expand the footprint of the Louisville Bar Association, and in a way to give a foundation for our involvement, and to give our membership and our strategic partners opportunities to engage with one another. And today is a great example of just that. While we can't do it in person, we're partnering with the YPAL, the Young Professional Association of Louisville, and Louisville Public Media in an effort to try to give all of our memberships an opportunity to learn a little bit about what's going on in the political landscape. I think every one of us would have to be living under a pretty considerable size rock to have heard nothing about the political comings and goings of 2020. But certainly, I think being able to have a partnership and an entity like Louisville Public Media in our community is something that we're all really proud of. And I think we are we benefit from the work of their reporting on a daily basis. And we all get to be a little bit more informed about our daily lives because of the hard work that they put in every day. And I was fortunate enough for a period of time to be a member, I'm still a member of Louisville Public Media, but also a board member for a period of time, and really got to see the hard work that they do day in and day out. So this is a really unique opportunity for the Louisville Public Media and for Louisville Bar Association to come together to provide, and YPAL to be able to provide its membership a unique insight into all things relating to the upcoming election in 2020. In an effort to try to give an introduction to the staff that's going to be talking about the election and some of the political aspects of what's going on, I'm going to introduce Stephen George, who is the president of Louisville Public Media. Stephen is a longtime friend of mine, somebody that I think very, very highly of, who's done a wonderful job of being the president of the organization. And we're all very honored to have him with us today and to lead the discussion with our group. So without further ado, just on behalf of YPAL and Louisville Bar Association, I present you with Stephen George. And Stephen, thanks for being with us today and your entire team. We appreciate it very much.
Well, thanks very much, Peter. I really appreciate that too. And on behalf of Louisville Public Media, thank you for having us. I know we're excited to be here, and we're excited to engage with members of our community in the work that we do day in and day out. Our mission is to inform people, it's to inspire people, and it's to empower people. And when I say people, I mean everyone in our community. And that's what we do every day at WFPL. We have with us today a really cool and is going to be a very interesting collection of folks who have different experiences and different information to share about city life, city government, state politics, city politics, national politics, none of which has been relevant in the news lately. So, I hope we can really connect to something here. And before I introduce them, I also want to give a shout out to Dexter Horn. Dexter is in the crowd here with us today, and Dexter is on our staff at Louisville Public Media and is also a key player at YPAL and helped bring this together for us along with the Bar Association. So shout out to Dexter, and happy he's here with us too. Erica Peterson is here with us. She is our Director of News and Programming at WFPL, which means she makes the coverage decisions in concert with our reporters and other editors day in and day out. Also with us is Amina Elahi. She is our city reporter and has been really our primary on-the-ground reporter covering everything that's been happening since the Breonna Taylor killing. She's been heavily present on our airwaves and on all of our digital platforms. Everything from long-form storytelling and deep dives and investigative work to the daily and minute-by-minute happenings, in that case on Twitter. She's done a phenomenal job for us and nationally. She's been all over NPR. And I think some other places as well. And then Rylan Barden is our Capitol Bureau chief. So he covers everything Frankfurt for us, and not only us. In fact, we're part of a consortium called the Kentucky Public Radio Network. So Rylan's work airs across most of the public radio stations in Kentucky. His work is heard in all 120 counties of our state, and he has a deep and profound knowledge of Kentucky politics and national politics and how they relate to Kentucky. So, we have an amazing staff at LPM as a whole. We have a phenomenal news team, and the folks you're going to get to hear from today, I know they're just going to be, I think this is going to be a really interesting discussion. I'm looking forward to it. So with that, I will hand it off and step out of the way so we can get to the real stuff here.
If I could just interject for a moment to the audience, if anyone has a question or comment, you can use the chat feature and you can address it to all the panelists or one or more. So with that, I'm going to drop out and listen. Thank you.
Okay, I guess I'll get it started. So I have a couple of questions that I've prepared that we'll start talking about. This was originally kind of conceived as, an election postmortem. Like, here's what happened during the election. Here's what we're going to look for in November. And we're still going to do some of that. As you all are probably aware, it was a really interesting election for a lot of different reasons. And I hope we can also talk a little bit about kind of just the current events that have been happening in Louisville and around Kentucky. But we'll have plenty of time for your questions too. So please put those in the chat box when you have them. So let's start with you, Ryland, because I think, of all the stuff that happened, of all the races that were on the ballot last month after the primary was, of course, moved because of coronavirus, the one that got the most attention was, of course, the Democratic primary for U.S. Senate. So now we know the results after months of speculation. It'll be Amy McGrath versus Mitch McConnell. Talk a little bit about what you expect those campaigns to look like.
I mean, I think that it's going to look a lot like the last time that Mitch McConnell ran for Senate in 2014, although this is the first time that he will be running for re-election as the majority leader. So he's much more of a lightning rod for those who oppose him. And as we've already seen, Amy McGrath has been able to raise a whole lot of money, a lot of which based on because of her opposition to McConnell. And I think that we are going to continue to see this being a big money race. She outraised McConnell, at least as of the beginning of this month, like $41 million to $27 million. So there's going to be a lot of attention, a lot of money, a lot of commercials and billboards, so people can expect to see a lot more of that. Then again, this is also this thing that makes this a lot different from 2014 is just how much volatility there is in the air, whether it be coronavirus or this great reawakening of racial injustice in the country. This is something, and especially on the racial injustice bit, this is something that, at least for the month of June, made, this was the central issue for Democratic voters. And it is going to be something that is going to continue forward into Election Day, and that drum is going to continue beating. But as we've seen, again, with this resurgence of coronavirus in the beginning of July, this is also going to be much more on the minds of folks as well. I think that one thing that's going to be really interesting to watch is what extent McConnell continues to kind of tie himself to the wagon of President Donald Trump. Donald Trump is certainly very popular in Kentucky, although he's not as popular as he used to be. And the point in which Donald Trump's polling has been the lowest throughout his first term in office has been in these moments in which, like in 2017 with his response to Charleston, and there were bad folks on both sides. This is when Donald Trump is at his most toxic, and a time in which we might even see McConnell not having a whole lot of ads with him there, and especially as the administration continues to try and right itself and right its response to coronavirus, which has been pretty bad so far and has polled very poorly as well. It's good that this is going to be a little bit of a dance for McConnell. Again, this still hasn't gotten to the level in which he's going to be distancing himself from the White House too much. But even right now, what we've seen with kind of this little the White House trying, there's Mitch McConnell coming out and saying that he trusts Anthony Fauci absolutely, and the White House now kind of trying to bring Fauci back into the fold and like having more images of him guiding the coronavirus response. This all kind of plays into this political moment right now, in which voters are kind of trying to figure out, all right, are the people who are running the show right now doing a good job of it, and how far does that sentiment continue down the ballot?
Yeah, awesome. Quick fact check. You said Charleston. I think you meant Charlottesville.
Charlottesville, my bad.
Another CH city. Yeah, it'll be really interesting. I mean, especially we've seen in previous elections, of course, the role that that healthcare has, been central to the campaigns, and that's something that Amy McGrath has spent a little bit of time on as well. But it'll be really interesting to see the role that it takes as we are in the middle of a huge, health crisis, not to mention economic crisis.
Right, and especially because so much of the big key points that we saw in the the 2020 Democratic presidential primary, that everybody was talking about, Medicare for all and, the Green New Deal, and, to a certain extent, these issues have kind of faded into the background, but, there's going to come a point in which Joe Biden and Donald Trump are going to have to come out on stage and kind of and argue over the specifics of these things, or the parties are going to have to nail down this as a just one-on-one race, and once again, like, these big things are going to come into focus. But I think coronavirus does, it puts healthcare at the front of people's minds. However, things are just so uniquely focused on the absolute rapid response right now of people getting tested, people being able to go to the hospital and expect treatment, and the whole health insurance discussion has faded to the background for a minute. I expect it'll come roaring back once again, but I really, the next step of this is going to be in Congress and what the Senate does in late July, whether or not they take up another coronavirus bill.
And before we leave the U.S. Senate race for a moment and turn our gaze a little bit more to the city level with Amina, let's talk about Charles Booker, because he had a late surge, obviously, in his campaign. He came very, very close to beating Amy McGrath, which wasn't necessarily projected a couple of months ago. What role do you kind of see him playing over the next couple months, and then after November as well?
Well, I think that Amy McGrath is really going to try to get him to, be an even more vocal campaigner for her. He has kind of come out and, you said that he's going to back her campaign and whatnot, but it's going to take a lot to, bring some of the progressive movement that he created into the fold under the tent for Amy McGrath. And that hasn't totally happened yet. That's going to, and she's going to have to kind of thread between Scylla and Charybdis here a bit, because her campaign strategy so far, or at least much of last year, because she didn't think she was going to have a very competitive primary election, was to campaign as a more moderate Democrat, and some would say a conservative Democrat, or at least to not distance conservative Democrats, and those are the very things that distance so many progressive voters. So now she's got to kind of figure out how to, get those horses back into the barn while not, losing some of those voters who she's built across the state. So I think Charles Booker is going to be important. He's going to, play an important role for trying to unify Democrats together. We'll see how that goes, how well it goes. And I think beyond that, there's kind of the sky's the limit for him going forward politically. I think that, it's going to be interesting to see whether or not he kind of, makes the decision to try to continue on in I don't know, politics in Washington, whether he wants to run for, Congress, eventually if and when John Yarmouth retires, or decides to not seek re-election, or, whether he decides to stick around and do city politics. Certainly his name has been thrown around for mayor in some time in the future. So he's a young guy, he's 35 years old. So he's got a lot of time to figure out this stuff. Also, he could return to the legislature and try to get reelected either to the, House of Representatives or even the state Senate.
So speaking of city politics, there were a lot, as you know, there were a lot of Metro Council seats on the ballot this year. Every even numbered district is up for election. And we got some of the hardest work done in the primary, in that two of the most competitive races, which were for District 4 and District 8, there are no Republican challengers. So we know that Ja'Cory Arthur is going to be representing District 4 come January, and that Cassie Chambers Armstrong is going to be representing District 8. So talk to me a little bit about, like, what do we have to look forward to for November? What other races are you going to be watching there?
Yeah, I think it would be good to maybe set the scene a little bit, just in case anyone is a little less familiar than we are with how Metro Council elections work. So there are 26 districts, so that means 26 seats, and they serve 4-year terms, but they alternate when each seat is up for election. So in 2018, it was all the odd-numbered seats, and this year it's all the even-numbered seats. So that's why we know the results in District 4 and 8. So the Metro Council elections or races so far, in addition to 4 and 8, we also know who's going to be serving for District 10 and 20. Those are both of the incumbents because they survived their primaries and also did not have opposing party challengers. So for District 10, that's Pat Mulvihill, who's a Democrat, and for District 20, that's Stuart Benson, who's a Republican. So we know those 4 seats, as well as a number of other incumbents who ran and did not have primary challengers nor opposing party challengers. We know that those are all in. So the 2 races that I'm going to be watching most closely in November are for District 2 and for District 18. And District 2 includes like the Newburgh area, and District 18 is part of the East End, like Hurstbourne. So District 2's incumbent, Barbara Shanklin, who's a Democrat, is running against, she'll be facing a Republican named Fali Abusa in November. He's a newcomer. She has been in her seat for a long time. She was a founding member of the Metro Council around the time of merger, around 2003. So she has a long history on the council, and she'll be a tough one to beat, in my opinion. And in the District 18 race, it's Republican Marilyn Parker, who also, has a history on the council, and will be facing also a relative political newcomer, Mara Corlett, who is a Democrat. And so those are the 2 races that I'll be focusing on.
What is the current makeup of the council, and is there any there's no chance that the control of Metro Council is going to swing in the Republican direction this election, is there?
Right. So Democrats have dominated the council for a long time, and that's probably not a surprise to too many people. But it was in 2018 actually that they really secured a supermajority. So Democrats currently hold 19 of the 26 seats. So that's a veto-proof majority. The only way that balance could shift in November is if Barbara Shanklin, who I just mentioned for District 2, if she loses and her Republican challenger wins, then that would shift it slightly. Now, if Mira Corlett wins over Marilyn Parker in District 18, then that would just sort of strengthen their supermajority a little more. So in terms of how that's going to shake out in November, there's really no way that Democrats are going to lose much ground. But one factor that's interesting is that David Yates, the council member for District 25, which is not up for election this year because it's odd numbered, he ran for state senate and won. So once he gets sworn into his state senate seat in January, Rylan, you can correct me if it's not January, but I'm pretty sure it is. The council will go through a process of selecting his replacement. So they will solicit applications from from residents of District 25, and they'll go through a process of selecting someone to finish out David Yates's term. And then that person could choose to run again in 2022, or it could be an entirely new candidate at that point. But it's really impossible to know who that person would be. But that'll be another interesting thing to watch. It's like, will that seat stay with the Democrat or not?
Thanks, and thanks for setting up a really nice segue to state house races.
I do what I can.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Ryland, I mean, there are a ton of state house races on the ballot statewide, obviously, and in the Louisville area. Can you give us like a quick rundown of just a couple that you think are particularly interesting, whether they're in Louisville or elsewhere in the state?
Well, I think that in the Louisville area, so since 2018, I think a lot of political watchers, especially if you're talking about Congress or state legislatures, they're looking at the suburbs. There's this kind of purple-ification of the suburbs, where they're, especially ones that are controlled by Republicans, are increasingly becoming more Democratic. So Louisville is a pretty good example of this. And I think there's at least a couple state house seats in the Louisville area that could be competitive. Kevin Bratcher's seat, also Jason Nemes's, they're both Republican incumbents. Bratcher's running against Suzanne Kugler, Jason Nemes running against Democrat Margaret Plattner. I think that kind of across the state, we're going to be watching similar things in northern Kentucky. Some people are wondering, it's Chris McDaniel, who's the incumbent and long-term Senate budget chair. He's going to be running a possibly competitive election. Also in the Lexington area, former Representative Stan Lee is retiring, so there's an open seat there that Democrats are hoping to pick up. And then kind of on the other side of things, just as urban areas have become more Democratic, rural areas have become more Republican, and there's just kind of a handful of seats across the state that Democrats could be vulnerable. Especially in Eastern Kentucky, there's a Senate race between two Johnny Ray Turners. There's an incumbent Johnny Ray Turner, and there's a Republican who's running against him, which is going to create a lot of confusion, I promise you. And Johnny Ray Turner is Democrat, and there's kind of Eastern Kentucky is this historically Democratic area. It's increasingly become Republican over really like the last 5 to 10 years, and Republicans are just kind of trying to seal that up and pick off more of those. The one Democrat who's really not at risk there is Angie Hatton in Eastern Kentucky, and she doesn't have any opponent, and she's a Democrat running there. So there's the legislature's a real patchwork. I don't think that there's really any risk of Republicans losing control of this, especially the State House of Representatives. That's where the most, that's obviously where the most seats are in play, but also where the competitive elections are. But there could be some a couple pickups one way or the other, and also it could just end up being a wash, which is pretty much what happened back in 2018, where Democrats picked up a couple more urban seats and lost a couple rural ones.
We're going to need a in-depth feature story on the 2 Johnny Ray Turners. That sounds like that would be really confusing for voters. So one of the reasons that obviously elections are so important, and especially this year, is that we're dealing with a lot of challenges both in the state and in the city. Anna, you've done a lot of reporting on the city budget, both in previous, perhaps more favorable years, and also in this year. Can you talk a little bit about what big challenges this, the next couple of months, the current council and the next council is going to face with dealing with the budget?
Sure. It's funny to hear you mention favorable years, considering the budget year that we had last year, when the council had to cut more than $25 million from from the budget that they would have needed to maintain staff and services because of increasing employee health care and pension costs. Now, some of those things were addressed over the course of this past fiscal year, and because of coronavirus and all of the ensuing budget issues, the pension rate increase has been locked in. So at least for the time being, for the moment, there's a little bit of a reprieve in that case. But council members and Mayor Fisher's administration have been saying for months that the budget situation for Louisville is really tough right now. It ended up at budget time. The council passed the budget at the end of last month, and as of July 1st, we're now in the fiscal year. But it ended up at budget time that it didn't turn out to be quite as dire as anticipated because of some of the tax receipts coming in when they did and at the levels that they did. So that ended up being, just slightly better than was anticipated. But they certainly weren't able, while they avoided cuts, they certainly weren't able to, add much in the way of city services and staff and things like that. And there's just so much uncertainty that still remains. I mean, the moment that we're in right now, we're seeing coronavirus cases rising again here in Kentucky. That could have a huge impact on businesses as we consider, continuing to reopen the state and how that will play out. That could affect employment. That could affect, obviously, what sort of revenue those businesses bring in. And both of those issues could have a huge impact on the city budget because Louisville's budget, the general fund, draws so much of its revenue from taxes based on occupation and net profits. So there's just a lot that's unknown in terms of how that's going to play out over the next few months. And the other big factor that we hear city officials talking about a lot is federal aid. And there's just a big question mark there in terms of what sort of federal aid cities might be able to anticipate in the future and how much there might be, as well as what it might be able to be used for. Because that was part of an issue with the CARES Act funding. Louisville got $134 million through that, which is certainly a large amount of money, but it was restricted to only specific uses. And so, if there's more federal money, that will be a question as well, how they can use it and whether it'll be able to support sort of general operations of the government. So that's something that, city officials, particularly Metro Council members, are going to have to consider since they're the ones who finalize and pass the budget. And the impacts of that are going to be felt for years. I mean, the same way they are for the state budget and the same way they are across the country. And then there's still the issue of the pension payments that hasn't gone away and will continue to increase in future years. So certainly not an enviable position for them to be in, but a lot to think about in terms of how to prepare for sort of the future pain that might be coming.
Yeah, and one of the things that is in the budget for next year is funding for the police department, which, as you are well aware, has been one of the calls that's been, that's kind of been resonating here is to defund the police. Talk a little bit about that, how the Metro Council is handling these calls for police reforms and police greater accountability, and also what other steps they're taking to respond to the protests that have been going on in downtown Louisville.
Yeah, as you mentioned, protesters here in Louisville, and not just in Louisville, across the country, have been really criticizing what they consider to be the overfunding of police. And we've seen people here and elsewhere calling for police to be defunded, which in essence means reallocating police funding to other services. And Metro Council members have by and large not offered support for that concept. In fact, for months, prior to these protests really cropping up in Louisville, what we were hearing from Metro Council members and from police was that Louisville police are underpaid compared to neighboring departments, and that we're losing officers. We have fewer officers than the city would like to have, and that's contributing to all sorts of issues. Retention is a huge issue. So this concept of just cutting the police budget is not popular on the council. Now they have talked about reallocating some funds for that they get through asset forfeiture to things like diversifying the police force and addressing some of the issues that have been raised recently. But more of the accountability action that we are seeing from the council is sort of forward-looking. So, for example, last month they banned no-knock warrants, which, as many of you know, is the type of warrant that was used the night that Breonna Taylor was killed by police in her home in March. And so, and Mayor Fisher did sign that immediately. So the fact that that's in effect now doesn't have any bearing on the result of any criminal investigation into her case, but the idea is that it would prevent future instances like that. No-knock warrants have been criticized for being overly dangerous both for civilians and for police who are serving those warrants. So the idea is to sort of protect everybody in that regard. The other stuff that we're seeing from the council at this point, I would say is more focused on the administration and metro government at this point. So for example, just yesterday, the Government Accountability Committee voted to initiate an investigation into the Fisher administration, focusing probably initially on response to recent protests, but also they want to know why what happened to Breonna Taylor happened. And they want to know why Mayor Fisher and his administration have responded since then the way that they have. And so, there will be some sort of juggling involved because there are criminal investigations in process. And so the council doesn't want to interfere with those and may not even be able to, based on what administration is able to share while that's ongoing. But that's one big thing that I'll be watching, and that is just sort of in the early stages right now. And the other thing is that the council has set up a sort of special committee that's focused on equity and inclusion, which essentially is trying to look at how resources and different things are allocated to different members of the Louisville community, and whether that is equitable and inclusive, just like the name says. So one of the first things that they're looking into is Louisville's Land Development Code. And they had their first meeting this week. They had an in-depth presentation from members of the Develop Louisville staff. And essentially one of the first things that they're going to be looking at is whether our land development code is fair to people of all races. So, what they learned about this week, or I'm sure some of them already knew about it, but what their presentation was about was issues that have been caused by historic racist policies such as redlining and urban renewal, which have just had long-lasting impacts that we see until today, influencing things such as housing and why we see such significant racial segregation in terms of where people live in the city, as well as issues regarding where we see, strong economic activity. That is also very limited in certain areas of the city. And so they're sort of on their way to reviewing how that land development code plays into all of that. So in terms of directly answering protesters' demands, there's, the no-knock warrants were a big one. Police funding, not so much, but they are taking other efforts, I think, to see what improvements they can make in local government specifically.
Yeah, there'll be a lot to keep an eye on. So I know you'll be busy with that. I've got one more question for Rylan, and if anyone has any additional questions about any of this, we'd love to take some of those. Ryland, like, so when Andy Bashir was elected, we kind of knew it was going to be an interesting dynamic, right? I mean, he's one of the only, he is the only Democratic constitutional officer at this point, right? That's pretty sure that's still correct. And we've got a Republican-controlled state house. So what have we seen about the way he's been able to govern and how that's been received? I mean, and I think there's kind of been a difference maybe in the beginning of the pandemic versus what we're starting to see now.
Sure, and I think it's definitely changed since the beginning of the pandemic. I mean, when at the beginning of the year, Andy Bashir is this first-term governor. He had to put together a budget, and he did everything that we thought he would do, which is kind of put the teachers who had vaulted him into office, at the front of the line. We're going to have raises for teachers. We're going to, stop the cuts to higher education. We're going to try and, increase K-12 budgets a bit. And it seemed like this is what the fight was going to be over. It's like, what the budget ends up looking like. And, then coronavirus comes at the beginning of March and everything's just thrown out the window. And I think that, if we're kind of drawing a graph of it, there's this beginning part where, nobody knew, and really to a certain extent, nobody still knows what's going on, but, nobody knew what was going on there. And we had relied on the governor for so much of our information about what's going on in coronavirus in the state. And I think everybody was just kind of glued to their televisions, getting the news from Andy Bashir. And I think that kind of goes for Republicans and Democrats. And then, we definitely saw over, the first couple months of coronavirus, the response to it, people getting frustrated with, business closures and now masking requirements. And that's definitely been the trend over the last couple months. Is there's been, the kind of traditional political fault lines have reemerged over this liberty issue, over this decision of over these questions of does government or should government have the power to do these things in a state of emergency. And really one thing is I would love to hear from however many lawyers are on this panel about to what extent does the governor have in a state of emergency these powers to try and ensure the health of the state. I mean, we've seen in some initial court rulings, especially over the agribusiness, the agribusinesses being allowed to not comply with the emergency regulations, and now wondering whether to what extent that's happening with masking too. I don't know. Again, the political lines have reemerged a bit, but I think that I think he's certainly expressing a lot more. He's gotten a lot more attention and a lot more power than he would have, had all of this not happened. That's just kind of like the political cynicism behind all of this. There's a lot more people who know Andy Bashir's name and know what he's up to these days than there were at the beginning of the year. And this is going to be an ongoing, political fight, going on, at the state level and national level, and it's going to kind of affect all those other races we were talking about earlier.
Awesome. That's all I have, except for a plug for our election coverage, which is at this point a little dated, but we will be putting out a new voter guide in October, and that'll be on our website, and it'll be a comprehensive look at all the races that you'll be seeing on your ballot in the Louisville area. It looks like we got a question too. Good question. Are local officials planning any changes to election procedures? For example, additional in-person polling places for November? Rylan, you want to take that one?
Sure. I think that everybody is planning that something is going to be different, but not sure what it's going to look like. The latest from Secretary of State Mike Adams. What's so interesting of this is that this has like a statewide element to it and a local element to it. So, Governor Bashir and Secretary Adams, they came together and kind of came out with the plan for how the state, or how, the state's going to operate in the election. However, it ended up being local election boards' decision to ultimately, have fewer in-person polling places. So some of them, decided to have multiple. Like Pulaski County had like 5 or 6, and Jefferson County only had 1. So there's probably going to be some changes. Secretary of State Mike Adams has been putting out requests for people to sign up to be poll workers, because that's really one of the biggest problems with trying to conduct an in-person election during the middle of the pandemic. Is Kentucky has this aging crop of poll workers. So many of them are in their 70s and 80s and are ultimately the most at risk for catching the virus and having a serious reaction to it. So we're just going to have to wait and see. Both Andy Beshear and Adams have said they want to have more polling places in place. Beshear has said that he wants to have, this kind of a universal mail-in voting, which we had during the primary election. Adams has kind of, been lukewarm on that, but it's going to kind of depend on what the virus looks like in a month or two, because that's ultimately when the state has to kind of start getting its ducks in a row, is like at least a month, but probably ideally 2 months before the election, to figure out whether or not they're going to have how many in-person places they're going to recommend for local officials to have.
Amina, anything you want to add on that?
Yeah, Rylan, you mentioned the one polling place in Louisville. Obviously, it was the Expo Center, and it was a huge polling place. But it's going to be really interesting to see how local election officials react or plan for November, just because of how much national scrutiny there was over the choice to have that single polling place. There were claims about voter suppression. There were concerns about people being able to access the polling place, and there was a lot of a lot of hype about it not working out well. And now that we see the voter turnout numbers, we have seen state officials really kind of gloating about it not being as bad as people were making it out to be. But there are still concerns, I think, about how people who may not have cars would access the Expo Center, for example. And there was a lot of nonprofit and sort of community work that went into making sure that people could get to the polls. And so I think a big question for November will be, if we see a similar setup like we did in June, is that going to be accompanied with sort of additional resources or even education for people who may not be used to voting by mail, for example, and may not trust it. And a lot of those issues also have to do with race and socioeconomic status, and those are populations that are often most at risk of not voting for various reasons. And so I think it'll be really interesting to see how that's handled by the people in charge, because it's possible that it could look very similar or very different. And whatever it is, it seems to be important that people know what all their options are in enough time to be able to take advantage of them.
Thank you. One more question. There's a special election for family court judge on the November ballot. Will you be profiling the candidates or otherwise covering that race? Yes, we plan to. I think something that's probably near and dear to a lot of your hearts are these judicial races that I feel like I personally am embarrassed to admit I've gone into the voting booth and not really known who I was voting for, because there's not a ton of information out there all the time about the candidates and the races. Something we did a couple years ago when there were a bunch of judicial candidates on the ballot was a series where we partnered with the League of Women Voters, who was having candidate forums, and we took their answers in those forums and transcribed them and provided them to the public, and they were immensely popular because everyone wants to make an informed choice when they go to vote. So yes, everything willing, we will be doing that again.
Eric, I got a question about when you think about just the politicization, I can't say that word correctly, of just fundamental things in our society, whether it's healthcare, it's schools. It seems like everything is viewed through the lens of a Republican or a Democrat. And I wonder if you all could speak to a little bit about whether or not, off camera, is there an acknowledgement on either side of the aisle as to the damage it could be doing to public trust, that, really you're getting to a point where you're not sure where to get your information from, given the fact that, it is, it may be viewed or supported by one party and viewed as fake news, so to speak, by another. Is there any, off-camera conversations about the damage it may be doing to society as a whole?
That politicians make, or are you just talking that like journalists feel?
Both. Yeah.
I mean, I'd certainly say that, yeah, there's times where you catch a politician, I don't know, even sometimes on the record, just kind of, bemoaning the current state of politics and how divisive it is, and how, everything ends up, I think it's kind of like a rhetorical problem when it comes down to it. It's like everything gets cast in such black and white terms, such binary terms. And I think that politicians admit that. I think that that's, at least from my perspective, that is like my number one frustration in, professionally and personally. It's just like that there's no room for nuance in politics a lot of the times. And for me personally, like how I explain that is that it's a function of our technology and our media that we've created. Like this is a function of everybody being able to be a publisher with their phone on Twitter or on Facebook, and that the fact that when given that torrent of information, the binary arguments cut the clearest through it. That's the stuff that you can get people to rally around. And I think that there's any number of times that you see that cropping up as a problem that ends up does create misinformation. I think that when we saw during the primary election with the kind of national movement of people coming up with this very clear distilled argument of Kentucky is suppressing voters because they only have one, or at least Jefferson County only has one polling location. And it's like, okay, I mean, there's arguments to be made that a rapid shift to mail-in voting suppresses votes, but it's a nuanced one. Like it's one that it's like, okay, the primary turnout's still going to be up. The mail-in balloting was expanded to everybody, and really, aren't there other things that suppress the vote a lot more, like having crazy early poll closing times, earliest in the nation at 6 o'clock in the evening, or the fact that you have to register to vote in an election a month ahead of time instead of day of in some other states. It's that nobody has the patience for that kind of discussion right now. And again, like I blame it on our technology. We haven't really become like a mature species of like consuming information through a cell phone or over Facebook. But that's just my take on it.
I would argue that we're maybe an immature species in other ways as well. But for the purposes of this conversation, an interesting thing that I hear when I talk to people about local politics, at the city level, is a lot of complaining about how, what's happening at the federal level, the rhetoric that you hear nationally, it's poisoning, what people think about local politics. And, I'm sure everyone has their opinions on that. But what I observe is a lot of bipartisan sort of action, specifically in Metro Council. There certainly is a lot of reaching across the aisle, and that is perhaps in part practical because, like I mentioned, Democrats do have a supermajority, and so Republicans, necessarily have to partner with Democrats in order to get anything done. But I will say it is notable to me that that the Republicans always seem to speak like as a group, and perhaps that's a function of the fact that there's only 7 of them. But whenever one of them makes an announcement, they all put out the same announcement on their email newsletters, which I receive all of. and so it's just interesting to see which groups tend to do that. In terms of the Democrats, we do see maybe more variation in the messaging. But again, they often vote as a block too. So it's just interesting to me to see that play out, even as you hear a lot of people blaming sort of that partisanship and the stubbornness in positions on what's happening on the national level. I'm not sure it's quite that simple.
Well, and thanks for serving up a great opportunity to talk about local media, Peter, as well, because we know that where local media is strong, people have access to different reliable sources of information. You can choose. You can read the newspaper, you can listen to public radio, you can watch the TV stations. Sometimes there are other independent media, in communities as well. When you don't have that, you, first of all, don't get information about local politics the same way you can in Louisville. You also end up relying on, places like MSNBC and Fox News for all of your information, as well as, Facebook and Twitter, and getting this, this diet of links from people who ideologically often are like you and believe in the same things you do. Which I think is playing a huge role in this partisan shift, and it's why it's really important to have independent news sources who, we don't always get it right, but we always try to, and we always aspire to be fair and accurate in everything we do. Anything else? Anyone else want to end this?
On a national level, I mean, any indication as to, on the presidential election side, there were certainly, if you go back 4 years, varying opinions, strong opinions one way or the other about one candidate versus the other. And is there any indication that what may be publicly stated, numbers were skewed towards Hillary Clinton, and ultimately we came to learn that, in the election that was maybe not an accurate reflection of what the real voter sentiment was at the time? Is there any indication from your all's perspective that we're seeing something similar? Because it's not hard to find that people view Biden as a leader right now in the election, but is that actually sustainable? Is that something that's sort of maybe mirroring what we saw 4 years ago?
I mean, it's possible. I think that if there's anything we learned from that, it's just that, add another 5% like variance onto any poll that you see. So, it's like, okay, yeah, things probably are leaning that way, but still, it's just, there's, especially this far out from the election, there's so many things that could happen. And yeah, like everybody should wonder if there's a great swath of people who don't respond to polls are out there. Or if there's a great swath of people who don't generally vote, who are going to vote. A lot of that stuff we don't know until it happens. So yeah, everybody should, rely on polls less, and, think and talk about policy much more is always my fallback as a political reporter.
I may steal that phrase, by the way. Scott, do we have any other questions?
We don't have any other questions. One thing that I wanted to announce is that we're doing a drawing we put all the names of the attendees in a hat and drew out a name, and the winning person will receive a gift card from our friends at the Monarch Brewing Company. So we've done the drawing, and our winner is Shannon Falver. So Shannon, we will be sending you a gift card to the Monarch Brewing Company, and our thanks for participating in the discussion today.
Well, I'll close, and then Erica, I don't know if you have any final comments, or Stephen, you want to say anything, but first and foremost, Amina and Rylan, I really appreciate your time. Truly, I think, Erica, you said it well, when we're very fortunate to have an entity like Louisville Public Media in our community, because we're able to get, verified data to be able to make informed decisions upon. But that's largely due to the fact of the great work that Rylan and Amina, you are doing. So thank you for your time and giving us some insight today. Please know that we are, the Louisville Bar Association is always here. So Erica, as you get into the remaining part of the year, and if you have questions as it relates to legal issues, please turn to us. We may not, I certainly will not know the answer more often than not, but we can find the right attorney who might be able to have an opinion and be able to give you some source on. So hopefully we can continue to build on this relationship in the coming months and years ahead. So, but on a personal note, thank you all very, very much for being here. To all those in attendance, we appreciate it. We hope you enjoyed it. This is, again, our first digital format of Louisville Unplugged, and we will be having more of these as the remaining part of 2020 continues on. So with that, Stephen and Erica, I'll let you all close this out with any final comments, but just know how much we appreciate your partnership and the work that you all do on a daily basis.
Well, thanks very much, Peter. I really appreciate it. Thanks to you, to Scott, to Lisa, to everybody who has been involved in pulling this together. Thanks to Dexter on the YPAL front. And thanks to our team, Erica, Amina, and Rylan, for such an informative, interesting conversation. Back in the day when we were in buildings together, I used to get to eavesdrop on conversations like this. And so it's nice to have it again. So thank you all very much. Thanks for your partnership with LPM, your support of LPM. And unless anybody has anything else, I'll say goodbye. Thanks, everybody.